You were taught to hold it all together, to smile when it hurt, to nod when you disagreed, to show up even when everything inside you screamed no. And over time, you learned to build an image, a persona, a carefully structured version of yourself. You became an architect of survival. You built your life like a house, one that looked stable on the outside, but was made of glass. Glass walls, glass expectations, glass emotions. Everything had to stay in place. Nothing could crack, because if it did, it might all come down. And that's the terror, isn't it? That if you stop trying to hold it all together, everything might fall apart, including you. So you work harder. You regulate every word, every response, every breath. You manage the impressions, the disappointments, the energy in the room. You become hyper-aware, hyper-responsible, hyper-functional. Not because you re-strong, but because you're scared. And here's what no one tells you. Control is not security. It's exhaustion wearing a mask. You think if you can just keep everything balanced, you'll be okay. That the anxiety will subside, that the fear will retreat, that maybe finally you'll feel safe. But the safety never comes, because you were not building stability. You're rebuilding tension. You're stacking cards, delicately, frantically, hoping the wind won't blow. And maybe people admire you for it. They say you recomposed. They say you reliable. They call you strong. But strength that comes from suppression isn't strength. It's survival in disguise. Carl Jung wrote, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." And that's exactly what's happening. The more you hold, the heavier it gets. The more you hide, the louder it screams. The more you pretend, the more distant you become from yourself. You don't even remember when you started, only that now you're afraid to stop. But here's the hidden truth. What you've built to protect yourself has become the very thing that's keeping you trapped. You are not free, you are maintained. And deep down, beneath the functioning, beneath the competence, beneath the polished smile, you are tired. Not tired from doing too much, but from never being real, from never breaking, from holding the weight of a self that no longer fits. But what if collapse isn't destruction? What if the house wasn't meant to last? What if letting it fall is how you begin again? Letting go sounds poetic until it becomes real. Because behind every tight grip, behind every act of control, there is a wound. You're not just afraid of falling apart. You're afraid of what might emerge from the ruins, of who you'll be when the performance ends. We don't cling to what's working. We cling to what feels familiar. Even when it hurts, familiarity feels like safety. That's the trick. You learned early on that chaos could be normal, that walking on emotional eggshells was just family, that silencing yourself was how love worked. So now, as an adult, you cling to order, but only because you were shaped by instability. You crave control because somewhere inside you, you believe that if things fall apart again, you won't survive. But here's the truth. You're not holding it all together because it's right. You're holding it together because you're terrified of the void. The silence that comes after collapse. The space where no identity lives. The moment where you no longer know who you are without the fixing, the pleasing, the managing. And that fear is what keeps the illusion alive. Because if you stop managing everything, who will you be? If you stop trying to be perfect, will anyone stay? If you stop performing strength, will you still belong? You don't want freedom. You want safety disguised as freedom. A version of liberation that doesn't ask you to lose anything. But real freedom costs. It asks for your masks, your control, your attachment to being needed, seen, useful, right? And that is terrifying. Because the pain of becoming yourself often feels like death to the self you've always been. But the truth is, the identity you were afraid to lose was never fully yours to begin with. It was constructed, brick by brick, from fear, praise, survival, and expectation. And now, It's time to let it crumble. Not all at once, not in a blaze of glory, but quietly, deliberately, like loosening a grip you've been holding for too long. So when your hands finally open, not out of surrender, but out of exhaustion, you begin to understand. What you were afraid to lose was never your freedom. It was your prison. You've spent years building it. Your persona. Your polished version of self. The one who smiles even when it hurts. The one who gives more than they have. The one who's always okay, even when they're quietly breaking. It worked, for a while. It helped you navigate the world, earn approval, avoid rejection. It gave you structure when everything else felt chaotic. But now, you feel it, don't you? The cracks, the weight, the distance between who you are and who you pretend to be. And no matter how carefully you keep it together, something is leaking through. Exhaustion, anger, bitterness, an ache that says, "This isn't me anymore." Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we present to the world in exchange for acceptance. He warned us, the persona is only a mask of the collective psyche, a convenient way of interacting, but not the self. But somewhere along the line, you forgot that. You didn't just wear the mask, you became it. Because it's easier to perform strength than admit you're tired. It's easier to be nice than risk being misunderstood. It's easier to keep giving than to face the terror of saying, "I have nothing left." And here's where it breaks. When the cost of performing becomes greater than the cost of being real. That's when the persona starts to crack. It begins with small refusals, a slower reply, a moment of silence, a forgotten smile. Then comes the pull, a craving for solitude, an urge to disappear, a voice inside that whispers, "I can't do this anymore." Not out of weakness, but out of truth. Because what's collapsing is not you. It's the version of you you had to become to survive. And that version is no longer sustainable. You've outgrown the mask, but removing it feels like exposure, like walking through the world naked, unedited, human. So you hesitate. Because you're not just afraid of being seen, you're afraid of not being accepted once you are. But the question is no longer, will they accept me? The question is, will I accept the parts of me I've spent my life hiding? Because this is where the rupture becomes sacred. The mask begins to fall, not in protest, but in release. And beneath it, you find someone softer, quieter, not perfect, but real. Someone who no longer wants to perform, compete, prove, or be good. Someone who just wants to exist without the weight of being someone else. And in that moment, for the first time, you begin to feel free. The moment you admit the mask no longer fits, something begins to shake. Not the world, not your relationships, you. There's a tremor inside, a silent cracking beneath the surface, like a structure that's been standing too long on a foundation that was never stable. You think, this shouldn't be happening. I'm falling apart. I need to hold it together. But what if that collapse isn't a crisis, but an invitation? You've been taught to fear breaking, to see unraveling as weakness, to associate surrender with defeat. But maybe that's the lie. Maybe the fall isn't the end. Maybe it's the first honest moment you've had in years. Because something in you knows, you can't rebuild until it falls. You can't rediscover yourself while still clinging to the version you no longer believe in. The tower has to fall. And yes, it's terrifying. You feel the ache in your chest, the knot in your throat, the sense that everything you've relied on is slipping, because it is. But that's not the danger, that's the liberation. What you're losing was never real stability, it was a performance of control. Carl Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Pain is not the enemy, pain is the doorway." When the career you built stops making sense. When the relationship you clung to no longer feels safe. When the identity you wore like armor becomes too heavy to carry. You're not breaking. You're being called inward. The collapse is not punishment. It's revelation. It reveals what was always there, just buried under layers of coping, adapting, and pretending. This is where truth enters. Not as light, but as space. Not as answers, but as absence. And in that emptiness, you begin to hear something else. A voice that was drowned out for years. Your own. And for once, you don't run from it. You sit with it. Not because you know what's next, but because you finally trust that whatever is being torn down was never home. Let it fall. Let it burn. Let it unravel. Because in the ashes, you'll remember something no mask could ever hold. You were never meant to survive. You were meant to become. And then it happens. Not with noise, not with screaming, not with the dramatic collapse you imagined, but with silence. Everything falls, and then everything stops. No more fixing, no more pretending, no more rushing to prove, to please, to hold it together. Just quiet. At first it feels unnatural, like walking through a room you once lived in but no longer recognize. The space feels too big. The stillness feels like a threat, because for so long, movement meant survival. Noise meant relevance. Tension meant purpose. Now, there's just you, breathing, present, untethered, and it's in this stillness that something deeper begins to emerge. Not the next version of you, not a new goal, but a feeling, a kind of peace that doesn't come from getting things right, but from no longer needing to. Carl Jung once said, "Solitude is for me a fount of healing which makes my life worth living." But solitude is not just being alone. It's being unmasked, unclaimed, uncompelled to explain. You sit in the ruins of who you thought you were and you notice the world did not end. In fact, for the first time you feel real. Not polished, not protected, but real. And real is quiet. Real doesn't beg to be seen. Real doesn't chase. Real waits, listens, breathes. You begin to see how much of your life was built around avoiding this moment, this stillness, this inner pause, because stillness holds a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. They don't flatter. They don't entertain. They reflect what's there, and what has always been. And here, without the weight of control, you realize something profound. You were never missing. You were just buried beneath everything you thought you had to be. So now you sit in the silence, not as someone broken, but as someone stripped bare. And in that stripped state, there is no shame. There is space, space to rest, space to feel, space to just be. No more fight, no more mask, no more need, just you, finally. You're sitting in the silence. The noise is gone. The world is quiet. And for a moment you think you're free. But then something stirs, not outside, inside, beneath the stillness. There's something waiting. It's subtle at first. A tightness in the chest. A flicker of shame. A memory you thought was gone. You try to ignore it. Breathe it away. Outrun it with a thought. But it remains. And the more you sit, the more it rises. It doesn't scream. It whispers. Do you see me now? This is what lies beneath the fall. Not just truth, not just peace, but the shadow. Carl Jung wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. The shadow is not evil. It's not wrong. It's just the part of you you've been trying to live without. The anger, the grief, the resentment, the envy, the desire, the power, the pain. Everything you silenced to become who you thought you had to be. Everything you buried so they would love you. so they wouldn't leave, so you could belong. But it didn't disappear. It waited. And now, with the persona in ruins, with the mask shattered, it's stepping out, not to haunt you, not to punish you, but to be seen. Because the shadow does not want to destroy your life. It wants to be integrated into it. The parts you hate in others, they're trying to show you what you've disowned in yourself. The people who trigger you, they carry the traits you were never allowed to have. The situations that break you, they're pressing on wounds you never tended to. This is the battlefield, not the world, not your past, your own fragmentation. You are not whole yet, but you're close, because you've stopped pretending to be whole. And that honesty, that rupture, is the beginning of real integration. To meet your shadow is to finally turn toward the places in you that were never allowed to speak. It's painful, yes. It's uncomfortable. Of course, it's necessary, absolutely. Because if you don't face it, you will keep performing your pain instead of healing it. You will keep attracting what reflects it instead of what respects it. And you will stay stuck in a life that is fine on the surface, but hollow at its core. But when you look at the shadow, truly look, you begin to understand. You are not broken. You are buried. And the parts that scare you the most are often the ones that hold the key to your power. You thought freedom would feel like power, like control, like everything finally going your way. But now you see the truth. Freedom has nothing to do with control. In fact, it begins when control ends. You spent your life chasing mastery, trying to perfect your mind, your emotions, your story. If you could just manage yourself better, you believed, maybe then you'd feel safe, maybe then you'd be free. But safety built on control is a fragile thing. It's always one mistake away from collapse. And that's not freedom. That's fear in disguise. Carl Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And control was your way of avoiding pain, avoiding the unknown, avoiding yourself. But when you let it fall apart, when you finally stopped managing everything, something strange happened. You were still here, no plan, no mask, no performance, just presence. And in that presence, there was no script, no pressure, no goal to reach. There was just peace. Because freedom isn't being above life. It's being in it without needing to dominate it. It's saying, "I don't know," and not panicking. It's saying, "I feel everything," and not apologizing. It's no longer reacting to be safe, no longer proving to be valid, no longer pleasing to be loved. True freedom is spacious. It has room for your shadow, room for your contradictions, room for your humanity. It doesn't ask you to be consistent. It asks you to be conscious, to move not from habit, but from awareness, to respond not from fear, but from truth. And that kind of freedom isn't loud. It doesn't scream, "Look at me, I'm healed." It whispers, "I no longer need to prove anything." It's not freedom from emotion. It's freedom in spite of it. The world may still pull at you. People may still demand your performance. Old triggers may still echo. But now, you're no longer held hostage by them, because the self that was once controlled by fear has been replaced by one who's finally real. And realness doesn't require armor, just presence. Once you stop performing, the world responds, not with applause, not with clarity, but with confusion. You don't chase, you don't explain. You no longer offer yourself as proof that you're enough, and suddenly things begin to fall away. People, patterns, places where you used to shrink to fit. It's not rejection, it's realignment. You're no longer available to what destroys you. Not because you've become cold, but because you've become clear. Clear about what drains you, what manipulates you, what pretends to love you but only on the condition that you stay small. The most radical boundary is not the word no. It's the energetic shift that says, I'm no longer willing to betray myself to be understood by you. This doesn't always mean walking away. Sometimes it just means you stop showing up emotionally to battles you never agreed to fight. You stop arguing to prove your worth. You stop over-explaining your boundaries. You stop bleeding for those who treat your silence as consent. Because now you know, anything that requires you to abandon yourself in order to keep it was never yours to begin with. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But privilege comes with a price. You will lose people. You will disappoint those who benefited from your compliance. You will grieve versions of yourself that were good at surviving but incapable of being fully alive. And still, you do not return to the fire. Because even in solitude you feel something you never felt before. Integrity. You are not who you used to be. Not because you added something, but because you stopped giving yourself away. Now you choose what you answer to, what you hold space for, what you feed with your presence. You've become unavailable to anything that asks you to disappear. And now, there's space. Not just around you, but within you. A kind of stillness that doesn't feel like absence anymore, but arrival. You're no longer gripping the edges of who you thought you had to be. You're no longer negotiating for worth. You're no longer defending your existence. You're just here, unapologetically whole. You are not performing peace. You are peace. Not because everything is resolved, but because you no longer need resolution to be okay. There's no more urgency, no more craving to be seen or heard or explained. What once felt like power, the ability to influence, to manage, to control, now feels irrelevant. Because you've found something stronger than power, presence. You used to react. Now you observe. You used to defend yourself at every turn. Now, you just don't participate. Not out of indifference, but out of clarity. This new self doesn't need a stage. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't even need to be understood. It simply is. Carl Jung said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. And you've looked inside. Not once. Not as a metaphor, but as a practice, as a surrender. And what you found wasn't perfection. It wasn't power. It was permission. Permission to be human, to be flawed, to be soft, to be real. You are not trying to fix the mirror anymore. You've stopped searching for the perfect reflection, because you've returned to the only thing that was ever true, yourself, unedited, unhidden, unshaken.